It is the autumn of 1963, and somewhere in suburban Ohio, a 14-year-old boy is pressing his nose against the glass of a Western auto supply store. Hanging on the wall behind the counter, between coils of garden hose and tins of motor oil, is a rifle. Not a replica, not a toy. A genuine United States military M1 carbine. The same weapon that paratroopers carried into Normandy, that Marines clutched on Iwo Jima, that pilots wore strapped across their chests over the Pacific. The price tag reads $10.95. His father will buy him one for Christmas. This was not unusual. This was Tuesday. For roughly a decade after the Second World War, millions of surplus American military carbines flooded the civilian market with the full blessing of the United States government. They sat in hardware stores, department stores, mail-order catalogues, and farm supply depots from Maine to California. The M1 carbine, light, reliable, and chambered in a modest .30 caliber round, was as unremarkable a retail item as a pocket knife or a fishing rod, and then in 1968, everything changed. The story of what happened to those 6 million rifles is a story about war, surplus, legislation, and the moment America looked at its own abundance and decided it had a problem. To understand why so many M1 carbines existed at all, one must go back to the extraordinary industrial convulsion of the early 1940s. When America entered the Second World War in December 1941, its military planners faced a fundamental logistical challenge. The standard infantry rifle, the M1 Garand, was an excellent weapon, but it weighed over 4.5 kilograms and was nearly 1 meter and 10 centimeters long. For the vast armies of support troops, vehicle crews, officers, radio men, and rear echelon personnel who needed a weapon for self-defense rather than frontline assault, the Garand was simply too cumbersome. What was needed was something lighter, something smaller, something that could be carried all day without exhausting its user, and fired with confidence at close range without the complexity of a pistol. The answer arrived in September 1941, when Winchester submitted a design that would become one of the most produced small arms in American military history. The M1 carbine weighed just under 2.4 kilograms unloaded, roughly half the weight of a Garand. It was 90 centimeters long. It fired a proprietary .30 caliber intermediate cartridge from a detachable box magazine, and it could be manufactured at extraordinary speed. Between 1942 and 1945, no fewer than 10 companies produced M1 carbines under government contract, including Winchester, Inland Manufacturing, IBM, and even the Rock-Ola jukebox company. The total production figure reached approximately 6.1 million rifles by the war's end, making it the single most manufactured American military firearm of the entire conflict. To put that number in human terms, if you laid those rifles end to end, they would stretch from London to Baghdad. By 1945, the United States Army possessed carbines in quantities it simply could not absorb. Warehouses across the country groaned with them. Depots in the Philippines, in Germany, in Japan, held hundreds of thousands more. The question of what to do with this extraordinary inventory would define the next 2 decades of American firearms retail. The answer, it turned out, was elegantly simple. The United States government would sell them, or give them away, through the Civilian Marksmanship Program, which had existed in various forms since 1903. The government began distributing surplus military rifles to American civilians at nominal cost. The program's original purpose was genuinely patriotic, to ensure that the civilian population remained familiar with military pattern small arms, so that in any future mobilization, recruits would already know how to handle a weapon. In this context, a surplus M1 carbine in a hardware store was not merely a commercial transaction. It was, in the eyes of its architects, a matter of national preparedness. Western Auto Supply became one of the most visible retail outlets for these surplus carbines, and their catalogue pricing, hovering around $10.95 to $17.50 depending on the year and condition, made the weapons accessible to virtually anyone with a modest income. Adjusted for inflation, $10.95 in 1963 represents roughly $110 today. These were not expensive luxury items. They were priced like tools because, in the minds of many Americans who bought them, that is precisely what they were. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. Throughout the late 1950s and into the 1960s, the M1 carbine occupied a curious cultural space. Gun enthusiasts appreciated its light handling and historical pedigree. Farmers bought them as working rifles. Veterans recognized them from their own service. And a generation of young Americans grew up treating them with the casual familiarity that one might extend to a bicycle or a shotgun. There was nothing sinister in this and nothing particularly remarkable. It was simply how America worked. The German response to the problem of the support troop armament had followed a broadly parallel course, though with characteristically different engineering priorities. The Wehrmacht's answer was the MP-40 submachine gun, a 9mm blowback-operated weapon that was cheaper to produce and easier to manufacture than a carbine, but which sacrificed effective range in exchange for rate of fire. At distances beyond 100 metres, the MP-40 became largely ineffective, whilst the M1 carbine retained reasonable accuracy to 200 metres and beyond. The Soviet Union, facing similar logistical demands, relied heavily on the PSH-41, a weapon of almost comical simplicity, stamped from sheet metal and fed from a 71-round drum magazine. It was produced in numbers that dwarf even the American carbine program, with some estimates suggesting over 6 million PPSH-41s manufactured during the war. Where the American approach prioritized a balance of accuracy and portability, the Soviet approach chose volume of fire above all else. The British Commonwealth, meanwhile, issued the Sten gun to rear area and support forces, a weapon so rudimentary in its construction that it could be manufactured in a small workshop for the equivalent of a few pounds sterling. The Sten was famously unreliable, prone to accidental discharge, and largely despised by the soldiers who carried it. By almost every measure, the M1 carbine was a more sophisticated and more satisfying weapon to use. Whether that sophistication justified the greater manufacturing complexity is a question that armourers and historians continue to debate. What is not in doubt is that by 1945, the M1 carbine had demonstrated its value in virtually every theatre of the war. It had proven itself in the frozen hills of Korea by 1950, and it had found its way, through military assistance programs and surplus sales, into the hands of police forces, partisan groups, and security services on every inhabited continent. Then came 1968. On April 4th of that year, Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee. On June 5th, Robert F. Kennedy was shot dead in Los Angeles. The political pressure for federal firearms legislation, which had been building since the Kennedy assassination of 1963, became irresistible. By October, President Lyndon Johnson had signed the Gun Control Act of 1968 into law. The act introduced the most comprehensive federal regulation of firearms commerce in American history. Among its many provisions was a clause that would prove fatal to the surplus carbine trade. The law prohibited the importation of military surplus firearms that were deemed to have no sporting purpose. More critically, for the domestic market, it imposed new licensing requirements on dealers, banned mail-order sales of firearms entirely, and created the framework of regulated commerce that still governs American gun retail today. The immediate effect on the surplus carbine trade was seismic. Mail-order sales, through which Western Auto Sears, and dozens of other retailers had shifted enormous quantities of surplus weapons, ended overnight. The casual, over-the-counter hardware store sale of military surplus rifles became vastly more complicated, and the pipeline of carbines flowing from government depots into civilian hands effectively closed. The roughly 6 million M1 carbines already in private hands, however, did not disappear. They could not be confiscated. The act was not retroactive in that sense. They simply became what they have remained ever since, a massive dispersed population of aging military rifles in private ownership, gradually filtering through estate sales, gun shows, and licensed dealers. Their retail value climbing steadily from single digits to the hundreds of pounds they fetch today. The legacy of those 6 million carbines is, in many respects, the legacy of a particular American moment. A moment when military surplus and civilian life were so thoroughly intertwined that a weapon carried at Bastogne could end up in a hardware shop in Akron the following decade. The civilian marksmanship program continues to operate today, though its scope and the weapons it distributes have changed considerably. The M1 carbines that pass through its hands are now collector's items, with original, unaltered examples in good condition commanding prices between $800 and $1,500 on the current market. The $10.95 rifle that once hung next to the garden hose now sits behind museum glass, or in a carefully maintained private collection. Surviving examples can be examined at the National Infantry Museum at Fort Benning in Georgia, at the National World War II Museum in New Orleans, and at various regimental museums across the United Kingdom that received carbines through Lend-Lease and wartime assistance programs. Return for a moment to that Ohio boy pressing his face against the glass. The rifle he received that Christmas, bought legally, sold openly, priced for ordinary families, represented something that his parents' generation considered entirely unremarkable. A military weapon mass-produced in the millions, made available to the citizenry through the deliberate policy of the United States government. Within 5 years of his purchase, the legal framework that made that transaction possible would be dismantled. Within a generation, the idea of buying a military surplus rifle from a hardware store would seem not merely unusual, but almost incomprehensible to many Americans. 6 million carbines were made, 6 million went to war, and millions came home to sit on walls and in cupboards and at the back of wardrobes across a nation that had not yet decided what it wanted to be. The 1968 Gun Control Act did not make those rifles disappear. It simply made the country stop making new ones available quite so easily. The ones already out there, already cleaned, already oiled, already zeroed, are still there, waiting in the dark of someone's gun cabinet, patient as only metal can be, for whoever opens the door next. They were made to last, and they did.